January 1945. The Western Front lies frozen under a hard, metallic sky. Snow covers the shattered tree lines, muffling every movement except the distant crack of rifles somewhere beyond the ridge. In a narrow slit trench overlooking a bend in the Our River, a group of German veterans huddle against the cold. Men who had survived Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. They know the rhythms of war better than most. They know the sound of artillery, its whistles and thumps, its warm-up volleys and probing shots. But what they hear now is wrong. A sudden stillness sweeps the forest. Not a single American gun has fired yet, and that silence becomes its own warning. One corporal mutters that the Americans are slow. Another smirks. Their artillery always fires late, he says. And then, without a second of build-up, the world detonates. 600 American guns fire at the exact same moment, so perfectly timed that the shells arrive simultaneously. The veterans don't hear individual blasts. They hear one enormous, rolling crash descending across the valley like a collapsing mountainside. Every instinct they trust fails them at once. And to understand how the Americans achieved this impossible synchronization, we must look back to where their artillery revolution truly began. To understand why German veterans were stunned by the speed and coordination of U.S. artillery, we must return to the years before the first American shot was ever fired in Europe. Because America's wartime firepower did not begin on the beaches of Normandy or in the forests of the Ardennes. It began quietly, methodically, inside map rooms, training fields, and mathematical classrooms long before the nation entered the war. In the interwar years, the United States Army was small, underfunded, and often overlooked by the major European powers. Germany, France, and Britain had centuries of military tradition, staffs of experienced officers, and large artillery parks. America did not. What the U.S. did have, however, was a different mindset, one shaped by engineers, mathematicians, and a growing belief that modern war would be won not only by bravery, but by precision. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, U.S. artillery schools in places like Fort Sill became laboratories of innovation. Officers studied ballistics tables, meteorological patterns, and the science of timing. They experimented with new fire direction centers, teams dedicated solely to calculating firing solutions instead of relying on individual guns to adjust independently. This single idea, the centralization of computation, would later transform the battlefields of Europe. Germany's artillery tradition was rooted in the First World War, powerful, accurate, but often slow to coordinate. Batteries tended to fire in sequence rather than in perfect unison. That worked well in 1916. It did not work in 1944 because the United States was quietly building something else, something far more flexible. American doctrine emphasized mobility. Guns needed to move fast, set up fast, fire fast, and shift targets faster than the enemy could react. The U.S. standardized nearly everything: gun types, ammunition, towing vehicles, radios, even the basic layout of artillery groups. When mass mobilization began in 1940, the Army didn't have to reinvent its artillery system. It simply scaled production, and American industry was uniquely capable of doing that. Factories in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Michigan began producing 105mm and 155mm howitzers at a pace no Axis nation could match. Radios, sighting equipment, and trucks rolled off assembly lines in the tens of thousands. But equipment alone wasn't what shocked German veterans in Europe. It was the way Americans used it. By 1942, U.S. artillery officers had refined a process far ahead of other nations. Forward observers called in coordinates by radio. Fire direction centers computed exact angles, charges, wind corrections, and travel times. Multiple battalions could fire as one unit. And when they chose to synchronize all of their guns, every single shell could land on a target at the same second. This was the seed of the legendary time on target barrages. German units facing the British or Soviets were accustomed to artillery that signaled its own arrival. First came the ranging shots, then the adjustment salvos, then the main barrage. Veteran soldiers had developed instincts for surviving it, listening for changes in whistle tone, counting seconds between shots, judging tempo, and diving into cover at just the right moment. But when they encountered U.S. artillery for the first time in North Africa in 1943, those instincts began to fail. German diaries described the new enemy fire as unusually fast, sharply coordinated, and overwhelmingly accurate. One noted that the Americans fire before we can react. Another wrote that while British and German gunners were skilled, the Americans appeared to have endless ammunition and very precise timing. Yet these early encounters were only the beginning. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, U.S. artillery expanded into one of the largest and most sophisticated systems in military history. Entire artillery groups, sometimes 50, 60, or even 80 guns, could be placed under one unified control center. Radios connected direction centers to every gun, and each crew trained to execute fire orders within seconds. By the time the first U.S. soldiers stepped onto Omaha and Utah beaches on June 6, 1944, they were supported by an artillery arm unlike anything the Wehrmacht had faced. It was fast, it was coordinated, and it could mass fire with a scale and precision that defied German expectation. But the real shock for German veterans would not come in Normandy's hedgerows alone. It would come during the breakout, the pursuit across France, and, above all, in the dark forests of the Ardennes, where the Americans would unleash a perfectly synchronized storm of steel that seemed impossible to those who experienced it. To see how U.S. artillery reached that level of dominance, we must look next to how it operated once the American armies reached the European continent. When American forces finally entered the European mainland in the summer of 1944, they did so with an artillery doctrine that was ready not only for static fire support, but for a fast-moving, modern campaign. And Europe would become the proving ground where the full potential of U.S. firepower revealed itself. The first major testing environment was Normandy. The Bocage country, with its thick hedgerows and maze-like fields, seemed designed to neutralize artillery. German troops used the landscape skillfully, slipping between sunken lanes, hiding tanks behind earthen walls, and calling in defensive fires with precision learned from years of combat. Yet even here, American artillery quickly demonstrated something the Germans had not expected: mobility. Because each U.S. infantry division carried its own organic artillery battalions, and because those battalions were supported by additional corps and army-level units, the Americans could concentrate guns wherever the fighting intensified. A German company facing what looked like a routine skirmish might suddenly find itself targeted by 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers and a battalion of 155mm guns, all firing within minutes of a simple radio call. This ability to mass fire without massing guns became one of the most decisive features of the U.S. system, and the Germans noticed. Reports from the 352nd Infantry Division described American barrages that developed too quickly to anticipate. Others noted that whereas British and German batteries often needed several minutes to adjust their aim, American fire arrived with immediate effect. Even veteran officers who had endured Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front admitted that U.S. fire missions seemed unusually coordinated. The lack of ranging shots confused them. The silence before the salvo felt unnatural. Behind every barrage was the quiet work of the fire direction centers, the mathematical engine rooms of American artillery. Inside tents or commandeered farmhouses, teams of specialists plotted grids on maps, computed azimuths, corrected for temperature, wind, and propellant variation, and synchronized the timing of each gun. Every shell's travel time was calculated down to the second. If a battery at the far end of a valley needed 28 seconds for its shell to reach the target, and another needed 24, the guns were simply ordered to fire 4 seconds apart. On the receiving end, the shells arrived all at once. German units facing this phenomenon began referring to it in their field notes. Some believed the Americans had developed a new type of explosive. Others speculated about hidden observation balloons or special reconnaissance aircraft. But the truth was simpler. It was mathematics, radios, discipline, and organization. Even more unsettling for German commanders was the sheer scale of American logistical support. Behind every infantry division were thousands of trucks carrying ammunition. So much ammunition that gunners could fire sustained barges without hesitation. In Normandy alone, American forces unloaded more than 1 million shells in the first month of fighting. And that was only the beginning. The Red Ball Express, created in August 1944, turned American artillery from powerful to relentless. Thousands of trucks ran day and night, carrying fuel and ammunition from the beaches to the rapidly advancing front. Artillery became a constant presence, supporting every attack, stopping every German counterstrike, breaking up every defensive line that tried to reform. As U.S. forces pushed toward St. Lo, artillery became the hammer that shaped the battlefield. Roads, hedgerows, and villages were shattered under concentrated fire. The German 7th Army, battered and exhausted, began describing American artillery as immediate and overwhelming. Even when U.S. infantry struggled to advance through the bocage, their gunners retained the initiative. But nothing in Normandy compared to what came next. By the time American forces reached the German border in the autumn of 1944, their artillery had evolved into a synchronized machine of extraordinary efficiency. The gun crews were experienced. The officers were seasoned. The fire direction centers operated with near-mechanical precision. And the supply lines, despite stretching hundreds of miles, continued to deliver ammunition in staggering quantities. German veterans increasingly realized that their traditional instincts, listening for ranging shots, predicting patterns, gauging intervals, no longer applied. American fire seemed to materialize out of nowhere. One moment the battlefield was silent. The next, it was consumed by coordinated detonations. And soon, in the forests of the Ardennes, they would encounter the peak of this evolution. The moment when 600 American guns fired in a perfectly timed single minute, creating a barrage so sudden and overwhelming that even seasoned German soldiers were left frozen in disbelief. But before we reach that tremendous shock, we must examine the angles, human, technological, tactical, and psychological, that enabled the United States to wield such devastating firepower. Behind every perfectly timed American barrage were ordinary young men who operated with extraordinary discipline. U.S. artillery crews were often made up of farm boys, factory workers, students, and clerks, men with no previous military experience. Yet they adapted remarkably quickly to the technical demands of modern fire control. Their training emphasized speed, consistency, and coordination. Each crew member knew his role intimately. The gunner aligning elevation, the assistant gunner adjusting deflection, the loader preparing rounds, the powder man selecting the correct charge, and the chief of section making rapid corrections. They repeated their drills until the motions became instinctive. Shouts were replaced by hand signals. Hesitation disappeared. A well-practiced American gun crew could fire 3 to 4 rounds per minute from a 105mm howitzer, sustained, without losing accuracy. German veterans later admitted that American crews seemed mechanical in their speed. But it wasn't machine-like ruthlessness, it was teamwork. Friendships formed around the guns. Crews lived together, ate together, dug in together. In the chaos of war, the artillery piece became a shared purpose and a shared refuge. Their reliability came from the trust built during long nights of smoke, cold, and tired hands tightening the same bolts again and again. This cohesion allowed American batteries to respond to fire missions in seconds. When a forward observer radioed coordinates, the guns were ready, always ready. And this readiness, repeated hundreds of times across the front, would soon merge into the synchronized storms that left German veterans bewildered. The human rhythm behind the guns became the beating heart of U.S. artillery. If the gun crews were the hands of U.S. artillery, the fire direction centers, the FDCs, were its mind. Few German soldiers ever saw them, but they felt their influence every time a barrage landed without warning. Hidden in barns, dugouts, or tents, these centers were staffed by officers and enlisted men trained in mathematics, cartography, and radio communication. They operated slide rules, plotting boards, firing tables, and meteorological data sheets with near-clinical precision. The innovation was simple yet revolutionary. Instead of each battery adjusting independently, the FDC calculated a single, unified firing solution for multiple battalions. And because radios connected observers directly to these centers, the system eliminated delays that plagued older artillery doctrines. A forward observer merely called in a grid coordinate and target description. Within moments, the FDC computed angles, charges, drift correction, and shell travel time for every participating gun. This made possible the legendary time on target, TOD, missions. Barrages where all shells, regardless of distance or direction, struck simultaneously. German troops had never experienced anything like it. Their own artillery, though accurate, followed a more traditional pattern, ranging shots, adjustment, than the main fire. U.S. artillery skipped that entire process. Fire direction centers transformed timing into a weapon. They turned mathematics into force. And because every U.S. artillery battalion used standardized equipment, radios, and procedures, entire divisions could function as a single coordinated instrument. The secret to American firepower was not simply how many guns they had. It was that every gun could be united by calculation. To the German soldiers who faced it, American artillery did not behave like artillery. It behaved like an ambush. Veterans of the Eastern Front were accustomed to the brutal intensity of Soviet barrages, the long, thunderous drum fire that rolled for minutes or hours. They respected it, feared it, and understood it. They believed they had seen artillery in its most violent form. But the Americans attacked with a different philosophy. Instead of overwhelming length, they used overwhelming timing. Instead of endless waves, they used sudden, precision-blended strikes. German diaries, after-action reports, and intelligence summaries repeatedly remark on the same traits. Immediate, unexpected, without warm-up, arrives at once, disorienting. Soldiers who had survived some of the most punishing firestorms in Europe confessed that U.S. TOD barrages left them more shaken because they could not read them, could not anticipate them, could not brace for them. One veteran described the first moment of a U.S. concentrated strike as the ground erupting without warning, as if the earth itself had betrayed us. Another wrote that American shells fell like a single giant blow from the sky. The absence of ranging shots destroyed their instincts. The synchronization destroyed their sense of rhythm. The precision destroyed their ability to adapt. And because U.S. barrages were often followed by rapid infantry or armored movement, German units found themselves stunned, disorganized, and unable to react fast enough. For the Wehrmacht, this was a new kind of artillery war, and one they struggled to counter. American artillery speed was not merely a product of skill or technology. It was the visible edge of a logistical system unlike anything the world had ever seen. While German units struggled with shortages, broken supply lines, and fuel rationing, U.S. artillery bathed the front in an uninterrupted stream of shells. This was the result of a supply chain that operated with industrial efficiency. Behind every firing battery stood not just soldiers, but thousands of trucks. The Red Ball Express, created during the breakout from Normandy, moved ammunition from Cherbourg and the beaches to the front lines around the clock. Drivers slept only in short rotations. Maintenance crews repaired vehicles in roadside fields. Fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and rest points were established in rapid succession. Theirs was a system built to maintain tempo, not for hours, but for weeks and months. This logistical strength gave American gunners a luxury few armies possessed: the freedom to fire without hesitation. If the infantry needed suppression, the guns fired. If an opportunity appeared, the guns fired. If an enemy counterattack massed, the guns fired again, sometimes for hours. Allied commanders knew that each division could rely on tens of thousands of shells delivered on demand. German officers, reading captured U.S. documents, were astonished at the volume of ammunition allocated per division. One report noted that the Americans possessed more artillery ammunition than we could deliver in a month. That abundance translated into confidence, speed, and constant availability. German veterans would later admit that American artillery seemed always ready, never fatigued, never starved for shells. This logistical engine ensured that when the moment came for synchronized fire on an unprecedented scale, every gun had the ammunition it needed. American artillery dominance did not arise by chance. It was deliberately shaped by generals and commanders who understood the changing nature of industrial war. Leaders such as Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, General Courtney Hodges, and Lieutenant General Jacob Devers emphasized artillery not as a support arm, but as a decisive weapon in its own right. Their goal was simple: to break enemy cohesion through speed, precision, and overwhelming concentration. Divisional commanders adopted a philosophy of artillery first, maneuver second. Infantry attacks were not launched until fire direction centers shaped the battlefield with carefully timed barrages. Tank assaults were coordinated with rolling fire plans designed to expose enemy positions. Commanders encouraged forward observers to act boldly, often placing them near the front to ensure rapid and accurate targeting. The decentralized authority given to these observers was revolutionary. Rather than waiting for high-level approval, they could call on battalion or even regimental-scale missions within minutes. The chain of command trusted its artillery officers because the system itself was designed for speed and reliability. German officers studying U.S. command methods after the war were struck by this freedom. Their own system emphasized centralized control and lengthy authorization processes. American doctrine inverted this. Speed and initiative were not only encouraged, they were expected. This philosophy reached its peak during major operations when entire artillery groups could be brought under temporary unified command. A single officer might direct dozens of battalions, coordinating them like instruments in a vast, destructive orchestra. It was leadership that turned American artillery from a weapon into a strategy, and that strategy would soon unleash one of the most shocking barrages of the war. Artillery is not only a physical weapon, it is a psychological one. And among German soldiers, the mental impact of U.S. fire became increasingly evident as the war progressed. Veterans who had withstood Soviet barrages expected long, grinding bombardments. They braced for noise that grew steadily, for shells that arrived in patterns they learned to read. But American artillery subverted all of these expectations with suddenness. The effect was disorienting. Soldiers were caught standing, walking, even talking, because there was no warning. Medical officers noted elevated shock symptoms, even among hardened troops. Unit leaders frequently reported temporary disorganization, broken communications, and disrupted formations after just a few minutes of U.S. fire. German counterattacks, once carefully timed, often collapsed before they began. Troops were pinned down. Radios were destroyed. Platoons became isolated. Their officers described the barrages as paralyzing and impossible to predict. Some units began pulling back earlier than ordered, fearing another instant strike. And morale suffered. Rumors spread quickly that the Americans had invisible observers, automated guns, or new machines calculating every shot. The truth was simpler but more devastating. U.S. forces had mastered timing, logistics, and precision at a level the Germans could not match under wartime strain. This psychological erosion laid the groundwork for a decisive moment. A moment when the United States would bring all its artillery strength together in one coordinated strike, unveiling an attack so sudden and overwhelming that even the most experienced German soldiers were left in stunned disbelief. By the winter of 1944, the German army was battered but not yet defeated. In the forests of the Ardennes, they launched one final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, an attempt to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. The offensive caught American units by surprise, and for several days, German armor divisions punched deep into the snowy woods. But as the initial shock faded, American command recovered with remarkable speed. And when U.S. Army responded, it responded with artillery. To the Germans advancing through the dense Ardennes terrain, U.S. fire initially seemed scattered and disorganized. Units from the 2nd Panzer Division, 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and Kampfgruppe reported pockets of resistance, but American guns appeared to lag behind the infantry. This perceived weakness emboldened the attackers. Veterans remarked that the American artillery seemed less active than in Normandy. But what they didn't understand was that the U.S. was repositioning hundreds of guns, quietly, methodically, relentlessly. American commanders, including General Hodges and artillery chiefs at 1st Army, recognized that reclaiming the initiative required firepower on a scale the Germans were not prepared to withstand. Over several days, they consolidated battalions from depleted units, moved fresh guns from reserve divisions, and reorganized entire artillery groups. What looked like disarray was strategic recalibration. Hidden in forest clearings behind low hills and along frozen roadsides, the Americans built a constellation of firepower. 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers were dug in behind snowbanks. 8-inch guns were dragged into position by exhausted crews. Even tank destroyer units were temporarily assigned fire missions. The artillery commanders intended to create the largest synchronized barrage of the campaign. Meanwhile, German troops pushed deeper into the American lines. They advanced through ghostly, frost-covered woods, their breath rising like steam in the early morning air. Veterans who had survived Kursk and Kharkov believed that the Americans lacked the coordination and supply capacity to mount a widespread counterbombardment. "They cannot match our pace," one officer remarked. "Their guns are too slow. Their shells are too few." He did not know that American logistics had already delivered tens of thousands of rounds to the front. He did not know that fire direction centers had gathered for an unprecedented coordination effort. And he did not know that U.S. radios, unaffected by cold that crippled German batteries, were feeding precise coordinates to a network of guns stretching miles behind the lines. On December 23rd and 24th, as skies cleared enough for artillery spotting and air reconnaissance, the Americans prepared for a response that would redefine the battlefield. Forward observers climbed to high points, creeping onto ridges despite sniper fire, identifying every German assembly area, road, and staging point. Artillery officers refined calculations late into the night, marking times, angles, and charges on map boards illuminated by dim red lamps. American commanders intended not just to hit the Germans, but to shatter their rhythm entirely. The orders spread quietly through the batteries, prepare for mass fire. Blades spun in the cold as crews cleaned fuses. Powder charges were laid out in rows. Shells were stacked behind each gun. Fuses aligned to detonate instantaneously. Trucks moved more ammunition forward, their engines rumbling through snowy roads that had turned to icy mud. German units continued their advance, unaware that the silence around them was not weakness. It was synchronization. By the morning of December 24th, more than 600 American guns, division artillery, corps artillery, Army artillery, and independent battalions were ready. Never before had such a concentration of U.S. firepower been assembled on the Western Front. Fire direction centers linked across the 1st and 3rd Armies shared calculations, coordinating shell flight times down to fractions of seconds. In their foxholes, German troops sensed a change but could not identify it. The forest seemed too quiet. No ranging shots, no probing volleys. The sky clear, the air painfully still. And then, just before midday, forward observers gave a single clearance word, sent over radio to every fire direction center and every battery involved. The Americans were ready. The guns were loaded. The clocks were synced. The largest time on target barrage the Germans would experience in the Ardennes was seconds from beginning. And with that final breathless pause, The stage was set for a moment that German veterans would remember with stunned clarity for the rest of their lives. December 23, 1944. The Ardennes forests were silent except for the muffled movement of German tanks and infantry columns pressing westward. Snow crunched under boots. Frost clung to the branches, sparkling under pale morning light. German veterans, men hardened by years on the eastern and western fronts, believed they had faced every kind of fire imaginable. Yet the Americans were about to redefine that experience. As German units advanced toward Elsenborn Ridge and Bastogne, U.S. artillery commanders finalized an unprecedented plan. Hundreds of guns, from 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers to 8-inch pieces, were positioned across multiple divisions. Fire direction centers spread across villages and forest clearings, coordinated timing down to the second. Radios crackled quietly as officers verified azimuths, charges, and shell fuses. Ammunition trucks idled on icy roads, engines humming, ready to feed the guns continuously. At exactly 1,100 hours, forward observers gave the final clearance. The silence was broken by a subtle prelude, a brief, almost imperceptible click as crews prepared their first rounds. And then, in a single heartbeat, 600 American guns fired. The effect was instantaneous. The forest seemed to collapse around the German lines. Shells from distant batteries struck at the same moment as those barely a mile away. The air trembled. Trees splintered. Earth erupted. For German soldiers, there was no warning, no discernible rhythm, no chance to brace. Their training, their instincts, even their years of experience, all were useless. Reports from German units described the scene with awe and terror. It was as if the heavens themselves had turned against us. One officer wrote, "Our men froze. We had never seen artillery like this, precision, speed, and coordination beyond belief." Another diary noted that every foxhole, every trench, every road was struck simultaneously. It was overwhelming. American gunners, working in perfect unison, shifted targets as pre-planned, ensuring that each wave of fire continued without pause. Forward observers called in adjustments, and battalion commanders verified impacts. Infantry units followed behind, advancing over ground already softened by the barrage. The Germans had no opportunity to regroup or counterattack. The sheer speed and coordination turned the battlefield into a cascading chain of destruction. By midday, the barrage had shattered the cohesion of several German regiments. Roads were impassable. Communications were disrupted. Morale collapsed. Units that had been confident in their advance withdrew under confusion. Some retreating before contact had fully occurred. For the first time in the Ardennes, the Americans had seized complete firepower dominance, and the veterans of the Wehrmacht recognized that they were facing something they could not match. This was more than an artillery strike. It was a demonstration of American doctrine, logistics, technology, and discipline converging in one overwhelming moment. And it left an indelible mark on every German soldier who survived that day, a memory of a battlefield transformed by precision, speed, and coordination. The devastation did not end with the barrage. What followed were immediate counterattacks, infantry advances, and armored maneuvers that capitalized on the chaos. The Germans' morale and organizational structure, once steady and methodical, was fractured. And for the Americans, this moment crystallized a key lesson. Well-coordinated artillery could dictate the pace, shape the battlefield, and shock even the most seasoned opponents into paralysis. By nightfall, the forests of the Ardennes bore the unmistakable imprint of U.S. firepower. Shattered trees, churned earth, and disoriented German units struggling to regroup. For those veterans, the events of that day were burned into memory. They had encountered speed, precision, and scale that defied expectation, and it would shape the remainder of the campaign. And yet, the full consequences of this moment, both immediate and long-term, would only become clear in the aftermath as the Allies pressed forward and the Wehrmacht confronted the reality of American firepower. The immediate aftermath of the December 23rd to 24th artillery barrage in the Ardennes was nothing short of catastrophic for the German forces. Units that had advanced confidently into the frozen forests now found themselves scattered, disoriented, and unable to consolidate positions. Roads that had allowed armored columns to move swiftly were rendered impassable by cratered earth, shell debris, and toppled trees. Communications lines were severed. Radios and telephone wires lay in ruins under the unrelenting bombardment. German reports from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and the 2nd Panzer Division described confusion spreading like wildfire. Commanders struggled to issue orders as subordinate units were mobilized. Soldiers crouched in foxholes and ditches, stunned by the sudden intensity and coordination of American fire. For many, the shock was compounded by the realization that American artillery did not simply fire, it anticipated. Forward observers and fire direction centers had orchestrated every salvo with a precision that left little room for German adaptation. Casualties were significant. Infantry units were decimated, and several companies lost the majority of their non-commissioned officers within minutes. Tank crews reported being immobilized by artillery craters and the sudden collapse of supporting infantry. Medical officers noted cases of psychological trauma, particularly among soldiers who had believed themselves invincible after surviving months of combat elsewhere on the Western Front. The sheer scale of the barrage, coupled with its synchronized timing, had broken the rhythm and morale of units that had otherwise performed competently under fire. For the Americans, the barrage achieved its intended effect. Infantry and armored units were able to advance with reduced resistance. Forward reconnaissance reported shattered defensive positions, scattered enemy formations, and disoriented command structures. The momentum shifted decisively. Commanders documented that the German response, which initially aimed at splitting Allied lines, had been blunted by the overwhelming speed and coordination of U.S. firepower. Intelligence officers collected German diaries, captured orders, and eyewitness accounts. Many entries reflected astonishment. Phrases such as unbelievable coordination, instantaneous destruction, and fire as if controlled by a single mind appeared repeatedly. The psychological effect extended beyond the battlefield. Even in reserve units, rumors of American artillery dominance spread quickly, contributing to hesitation and disorder among troops called to reinforce the front. But the aftermath was not only measured in destruction. The barrage validated the doctrinal and logistical principles developed by U.S. forces over years of preparation, mobility, concentration, precision, and rapid communication. It confirmed that a well-coordinated artillery system, supported by continuous supply lines, could deliver both material and psychological devastation on an unprecedented scale. By nightfall, as the artillery finally ceased its relentless pounding, German forces attempted to regroup. Yet the momentum had shifted irreversibly. U.S. divisions that had weathered the initial surprise were now pressing forward, exploiting the chaos with infantry and armor in coordination with continued artillery support. The Ardennes, once the scene of German initiative, had become a landscape dominated by American firepower, speed, and discipline. This moment marked not just a tactical success, but a turning point in the Ardennes campaign. The Germans had underestimated the scale and precision of American artillery, and the consequences were immediate: shattered units, broken morale, and an unmistakable advantage for the Allies. The stage was set for the strategic effects that would ripple across the remainder of the campaign and cement the reputation of U.S. artillery as a decisive force in the latter stages of the European War. The long-term consequences of the December 1944 artillery barrage in the Ardennes extended far beyond immediate casualties and destroyed positions. Strategically, it signaled a profound shift in the balance of firepower on the Western Front, confirming that American artillery could dominate, suppress, and even paralyze seasoned German units. The shock endured by German veterans was not a fleeting sensation. It altered how the Wehrmacht conducted operations for the remainder of the campaign. German high command quickly realized that traditional defensive tactics were no longer sufficient. Concentrated troop formations became liabilities, and supply convoys faced extreme vulnerability to coordinated barrages. The notion of advancing with speed and cohesion was undermined by the American ability to mass fire over multiple miles of front lines. Even elite units, veterans of prior campaigns, began to withdraw or scatter preemptively when U.S. artillery positions were detected. Reports note that, in some sectors, entire regiments refused to hold forward positions, fearing further destruction from invisible and unstoppable fire. For the U.S., the psychological and operational success of this massive barrage reinforced doctrinal confidence. Field manuals and after-action reports praised the effectiveness of time-on-target techniques, centralized fire direction, and sustained supply operations. Forward observers were commended for their courage in identifying targets under enemy fire, and artillery units gained recognition for their role as a decisive force rather than merely a support arm. The integration of logistics, technology, and training became a model studied extensively in post-war analyses. The battlefield itself bore lasting evidence. Satellite-like maps and photographs taken days after the strike reveal shattered roads, cratered forests, and disrupted defensive lines. Subsequent infantry and armor advances faced little organized resistance, illustrating the enduring tactical advantage generated by the barrage. German accounts repeatedly highlight the psychological toll. Soldiers described an inescapable hammer effect, where fear of sudden, perfectly timed artillery fire constrained decision-making, slowed responses, and fostered fatalistic attitudes. The success in the Ardennes also influenced subsequent Allied operations. American forces replicated similar concentrated fire missions in the final push across the Rhineland and into Germany proper. Each operation reinforced the strategic principle demonstrated in December 1944. Well-coordinated, rapidly executed artillery barrages could determine the tempo of battle, inflict disproportionate casualties, and demoralize even veteran opponents. Historians have since noted that these events marked a turning point in modern artillery doctrine. The Germans, who had relied on experience, instinct, and measured fire, were confronted with a new paradigm: speed, precision, and overwhelming coordination as decisive factors. The psychological dimension, shock, confusion, and awe among German troops, was as significant as the physical destruction, proving that industrialized firepower, guided by discipline and calculation, could break even the most resilient opponents. By the close of 1944, the Ardennes campaign illustrated the full potential of U.S. artillery. German counteroffensives stalled, morale waned, and Allied momentum surged. The veterans who survived the barrage carried vivid memories of the precision and speed that had upended their expectations. And for the U.S. Army, the success validated years of training, logistics, and doctrinal development, setting the stage for the final Allied advance into Germany. The moment was decisive, but the story is not yet complete. To fully grasp the significance of American artillery mastery, we must reflect on its broader implications. The transformation of warfare, the human cost and resilience, and a lesson for generations of soldiers, strategists, and historians that followed.